So thank you to the Goodrich Library and thank you to Vermont Humanities for having me here tonight. Hanging Out, The Radical Power of Killing Time was launched last January in hardcover, and a new paperback edition will be published on Friday this week. So this marks basically the start of my new launch for this new version of the book. And the book has recently been expanded with a new afterword. And that is what I'm going to be reading some from tonight, in part because it's some added content that I can have to add on to the conversations that I've already been having about hanging out for the past year. And also because the afterword is very Vermont-centric, as you'll find as I go through some of that material. So I'll look forward to discussing whatever questions or thoughts you have about hanging out after I do some reading from the book. And I thank you for being here with me tonight. I recently spent an afternoon at the end of the world. It happened in Seattle. I was visiting my family there, just as I do most summers. My partner Dave was with me, and so was my mother. She was clinging to my arm when the three of us stepped forward into a dark, mist-smeared void, where the air around us smelled acrid and briny and suggestive of ruin. For the first few minutes, we just stood there, huddling near the threshold and close to the memory of light. It was all we could do while we waited for our eyes to adjust. And then, as they did adjust, we started to explore the space around us. What we found were bodies, people. Some of them were standing, some of them were propped against walls, and some were splayed out on the floor, corpse-like. We picked our ways around and over them at first, and then we joined them. In a far corner, I got to my knees and I helped my mother, who's in her 70s, into a sitting position. Then I stretched out on the floor as I had seen others doing, and she and Dave did the same. We stared upward at a faint beam of light that was spattered with moving shadow. It would come and go, undulating, fading, and then surging forth again before cutting out completely. In the moments when it shone most brightly, I could see the others there in the room. There must have been 20 or 30 of them. But then they would disappear again and I would be left alone, or seemingly alone, in a quick privacy of darkness. All the while, sound stalked the space. It grew from a deep swelling of bass that migrated in a rush throughout the room, filling it from end to end. And then came a storm of sonic texture, tearing and scratching, digging, shredding, burning. I could hear wild dogs rooting amongst debris, and also nervous human whispers, barely audible. Finally, these sounds subsided and were replaced by a choir. It sang in an unknown language and moved haltingly from a series of minor chords to, at last, a major one, sounding a note of shy hope. Above the choir, a falsetto voice floated lightly, like sun on water. The whole thing took about 25 minutes. Dave, my mother, and I stayed longer, though, enough to watch the whole thing unfold multiple times. Others around us did too, electing to bear witness to an end that seemed to have no end, just kept coming. The first time through, I surprised myself by crying. The tears ran into my eyes and into my hair as I lay there on the floor, wedged between the bodies of two people I love. I cried over a simulated experience of profound and devastating loss. I had mislaid the world I knew. I was floating in space. I was buried underground. I was cloistered in the hold of a ship and set adrift and rocking on waves. And then, as the cycle started over once more, I gradually regained my awareness of my actual surroundings. I was in a room, a familiar one. I could feel the carpet beneath me. I hadn't been there a few Christmases ago when I had visited the same room to view the works of a 19th century Danish painter on display there. Back then, it had been polished hardwood floors to match the gleaming gilt frames of the paintings. And now it was darkness and smoke and bodies, including that of a man in a Seahawks jersey who was seated in a half lotus position just across from me. From my vantage point in the corner, I could watch others arrive and enter into our void. They would stumble in and stand there as I had stood there, struck dumb by the darkness, which for me had grown less threatening and more familiar. Then, as the bass tones announced another cycle beginning, I helped my mother to her feet and collected her purse from the ground, and the three of us wound back through the sea of bodies toward the bright July day that waited for us outside. The occasion for this sojourn to the end of the world was, in reality, an art exhibit called Flowed by the Icelandic multimedia artist Jonsi, which was designed for site-specific presentation at the National Nordic Museum in Seattle. I didn't know it at the time, but I had actually experienced the whole thing in reverse. The combination of light, sound, and scented fog, as Jonsi has explained in interviews, is actually supposed to begin with the hopeful choir part and end with the violent, destructive part. What starts out as, quote, 16 voices distributed individually across speakers becomes a big wave. The voices are drowned by the wave and then replaced by a mix of field recordings that Jonsi has made, in which he calls textures, all of it serving as a metaphor for rising seas brought about by climate change. Jonsi, who is also the lead singer of the melodic post-rock band Sigur Rós, says that the installation grew out of his fixation on, quote, the big wave and how we're all going to die and everything is going to flood. The idea was to become engulfed, it seemed, in the exhibit, not to emerge from it. But that's not how I experienced it. Rather, because my entrance into the gallery had coincided with the initial moment of destruction, what was supposed to exist before came afterwards for me. The voices of the choir rose out of Jonsi's frenzy of sonic textures, instead of the other way around. Seen in this way, the exhibit spoke not only of despair, but also of hope, struggle, and something new that was spluttering to life. The fact that Jonsi devised the piece as a loop actually invites this kind of inverse reading. The viewer is forced to discover entrances and exits for herself in it, and to craft her own version of a story that might fall somewhere between those poles. This is what we were all doing there, the 20 or 30 of us who rested and cried and looked and heard and hung out inside the space of the float exhibit. We were devising stories from the disjointed wreckage of sensory experience, trying to make meaning from it all. We were doing it separately in accordance with our own logic and guided by our own subjective impressions, but we were doing it together. We were giving ourselves over to an experience of collective undoing, of mass fragility. I carried that feeling of mass fragility with me when I left the exhibit. It clung to me a bit like how my mother had clung to my arm for balance when we were inside it. I thought about what it meant to have hung out without conversation and with little shared acknowledgement in that space of simulated disaster. I thought about the guy in the Seahawks jersey, about the cautious way that we had eyed each other and saw each other. And because the exhibit encouraged me to, I compared my impressions of it to real disasters, both hypothetical and otherwise. About 3 weeks before I'd left Seattle, you see, my home state of Vermont had flooded. It all started with rain that fell and fell, 2 whole uninterrupted days worth of rain. And even as I write this, or I should say now in the past tense, even as I was writing this some months ago, the flood and its aftermath is still very much with us in Vermont, though the rain did eventually stop. The public high school in Montpelier, where I gather on Tuesday nights with other bagpipers, you can see it here in that photo, a precious experience when you play an eccentric instrument like the bagpipes, had only reopened its doors to us. And just weeks before that, there were still FEMA trailers taking up space in its parking lot. Its ground floor had been entirely submerged in the July floods. The same went for much of Montpelier. Its downtown district had yet to regain a sense of normalcy, and many of the businesses there are still closed. The bar where the summer before I had sat and talked about hanging out and writing a book about hanging out with a friend over some fries and lunch beers, the same bar where I had dinner with a long-lost college friend who I hadn't seen in 15 years, but who showed up to a reading I was doing at a local library, is still closed. All over the state, the rivers and waterfalls where I like to swim each summer had continued to run high and prevented me from going near them. The Intervale Community Farm in Burlington, where I do my volunteering, which saw 99% of its land submerged in the floods, had to temporarily halt its summer CSA program. And the flower farm next door, where Dave and I had danced on the grass in June amid zinnias and black-eyed Susans, was a welter of mud. I talk a lot about space in the book Hanging Out because space is one of the essential ingredients required for social activity. In the wake of the Vermont floods, though, I was thinking not just about the scarcity of spaces that foster that activity, but also about the constant vulnerability that defines them, even when they manage to exist. The float exhibit in Seattle nudged all of this thinking one step further. It brought me face to face with the prospect, and indeed the virtual experience, of their total erasure. Crisis can bring about a much needed confrontation with community. It's not the best or the most desirable way to hang out, obviously, but it's one way that hanging out does happen. Rebecca Solnit, in a book she wrote on the subject of communities that form in the wake of crisis, observes as much, noting how, quote, disaster requires an ability to embrace contradiction in both the minds of those undergoing and those trying to understand it from afar. In each disaster, there is suffering, there are psychic scars that will be felt most when the emergency is over, there are deaths and losses, but, as Solnit writes, there are also satisfactions, newborn social bonds, and liberations. In Seattle, while lying on a carpet surrounded by the prostrate bodies of loved ones and strangers alike, I thought about hypothetical floods and future floods, and also about real floods, floods in the past. Back when I used to live in North Dakota, for example, it was in a town where some decades before I arrived there, flooding had prompted the largest evacuation of an American population since the Civil War. On my regular runs through the downtown district, I would pass by the flood monument, which takes the form of a sandstone and concrete pillar rising beside the river that once was the cause of the town's suffering. It marks the high water point from the 1997 disaster, 54.35 feet. I would pause at its base on my run and look up and imagine the glint of all that light reaching toward me through the water. In October 2019, when coastal hurricanes pushed heavy rains inland and delivered them to the Midwest, Dave and I mucked out our basement with borrowed gear from our neighbors. The whole street passed shop vacs around and dragged heavy rolls of carpet out of each other's basements, piling them on berms alongside broken furniture and strips of muddy flooring. And then again in the spring of 2020, as the COVID pandemic descended, Dave and I found ourselves running a monotonous figure eight through our North Dakota neighborhood because the river, having jumped its banks yet again, was blocking our usual running route. We couldn't trace our normal path to the flood monument because we had a flood of our own to deal with right in our backyard. I have lived with floods and also with their historical scars. I have walked streets that were born anew because of water, and likewise those that were decimated by it, rinsed of the things, homes and businesses and parks and trees that once made them livable. And I've stood on bridges in the company of my neighbors and my friends and strangers alike and watched the water go thundering past. Annie Dillard, in her classic work, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, writes memorably about a similar experience that rocked her rural Virginia community. Quote, neighbors who have barely seen each other all winter are there together, shaking their heads. They've never seen it before. The water is over the bridge. This is the thing about weather, which is also the thing about water. When it comes for everyone, and thus creates ready-made forms of connection and instant topics of conversation. It shouldn't take a flood in order to hang out with your neighbors, but sometimes that's exactly what it takes. One of the things that came out of the 1997 flood in Grand Forks, North Dakota, was the creation of a new town square. Decades later, it was in that town square that I first met my friend, who became a reality TV star, which I talk about in the book. I attended town dances in that square and farmers markets. I did yoga in that square, and though I do not ice skate, each December, I would watch ice skaters there as they covered the rink, this time flooded on purpose, and skated their arcs around it. The environmental literature scholar Christopher Schaberg, in an elegiac work called Searching for the Anthropocene, writes about how water in the context of climate change becomes a bigger and more inevitable facet of life on Earth. There is no choice but to notice the water that threatens to rise or recede or otherwise reshape the land around us. As Schaberg writes, quote, part of the Anthropocene is realizing the inescapability of being on the water in varying senses of that term. This means coastal erosion and melting ice caps, but also dying reefs and rogue tempests. It's how humans are comprised of and depend on water to a limit. How we maintain an awareness of this fact and consciously interact with water or ignore it and repress its realities may be one of the crucial indicators of how the Anthropocene plays out. The term Anthropocene formalizes the link between human behavior and the natural world by naming a process of epochal transformation that left lasting impacts on the Earth. It marks the dawn of human dominance over nature and also the entrenchment of certain social habits that have taken shape alongside that quest for dominance. Among those social habits is privacy, or the process by which human independence came to be seen as a good thing, a privileged thing, an honorable thing, instead of as the opposite as of any of that. As the world has become more and more human, more subject to the whims of human-centered activity, and more committed to carrying on in spite of all the consequences, so too has it become more lonely. Hanging out then becomes a means of processing those feelings of mass fragility that I've been talking about, an antidote to the loneliness that would seek to weaponize and turn them against us. Rather than avoiding the messiness and complications of others, hanging out becomes a way of embracing it and them, of turning towards instead of away from the catastrophe, whether via rising floodwaters or forests set aflame. After all, it's easier to prepare when you can see what's coming ahead of you. I've done a lot of hanging out since the hardcover publication of the book Hanging Out last year. There have been interviews and podcast appearances and presentations and public readings. And from these interactions, I have acted as an audience to others' efforts to make hanging out happen, to their ironclad determination to see that work done, in spite of all the complexities that are known or feared to come with it. This tendency is like a version of what the critic Lauren Berlant calls wanting the world, a desire which often meets with opposition in the form of what Berlant calls inconvenience. As Berlant writes, the inconvenience of the world is at its most confusing when one wants the world but resists some of the costs of wanting. However, as Berlant also makes clear, we cannot know each other without being inconvenient to each other. What this means is that to be in the world and of the world means to be with it, as well as to bear all the burdens, grammatical and otherwise, that descend from that whole string of prepositions. Hanging out is a way to experience the in and the of and the with all at once, with an awareness of the mess that often results from doing so. It's a way to not just address the problems and stresses of the mass fragility that I've been talking about here, but to actively crowdsource solutions in order to construct a path that leads elsewhere out of the clutches of mass fragility. It's work that cannot be done cleanly or comfortably, and work that cannot be carried out in isolation. This is what makes hanging out, which requires the suspension of minor forms of personal discomfort in the name of enhanced social connection, an essential part of that work. Hanging out is about more than improvisation and play, though it starts with both of those things. It's about acknowledging the work that needs to be done and playing at it together. So many of the conversations that I've been having since the initial publication of the book Hanging Out have occurred in the places that give rise to that sort of work. I'm talking about third places, of course, libraries, schools, bookstores, coffee shops, meeting halls, even grocery stores. I was elated to say Hanging Out cited in, for example, of all places, a local Vermont grocery store's weekly circular. But these places, though they fight against the incursion of those feelings of mass fragility, are not immune to its effects. If anything, they are extra vulnerable to them and thus liable to end up neglected or forgotten until rising floodwaters compel us to remember how much we actually need them. It shouldn't take a flood in order to hang out, or to remind us of how much we depend on the places and the people and the institutions that endure for the sake of allowing us to hang out. It shouldn't, because if it does, it might already be too late. The German-born philosopher Hannah Arendt, writing in her adopted country in the 1940s, observes that people in America are lonely because they are busy. Quote, "In this country," she tells her friend Gershom Scholem in a letter, "one gets very lonely because people have so many things to do that after a certain point, the need for leisure is quite simply no longer there. The result of this is a certain absence, by which I mean absent-mindedness, that makes the contact between people so difficult." Arendt's point is that the strain brought about by constant activity, or by the apparent necessity of performing that kind of activity, prevents one from not just enjoying, but even experiencing leisure. Labor becomes the guiding mantra behind all experience, regardless of the particular objective, and hanging out, what Arendt calls the contact between people, starts to feel unmanageable. Similarly, the media scholar Marshall Berman, writing in the 1980s, described the conditions of modernity as precarious, frenetic, and seemingly prone to evaporation. In his classic book, All That Is Solid Melts into Air, he comments on the paradox of unity, which he calls a unity of disunity. Modernity, Berman says, refers to a set of circumstances that everyone on Earth is fated to experience. Its power lies, ironically enough, in convincing them that they are the first to experience them, and in thus making them feel helpless and alone. All that is believed to be solid then melts into air. It dissipates on the wind and becomes impossible to catch. In our present moment, we find a situation that is at once similar to Berman's in the 80s and Arendt's in the 40s, for that matter, and yet also more advanced and different. All that is firm dissolves into liquid. It ends up in the sea or in the nearest river, or it slips through our fingers and it disappears down the drain. This is how it can feel to watch the waters rise, and this is also why it feels so hard to hang out sometimes. There is a liquidness to contemporary life, a feeling that one is caught up in the current of things that must get done, yet never seem to make anything better, to recall Arendt's comment. Hanging out means acquiring the capacity and the will to stand still and let the water go rushing past, if even for a moment. It means calling the friend you've been meaning to call, striking up a conversation with a stranger, getting to know your neighbor, volunteering, or joining a club or a committee. In order to tackle the big existential threats of our time, we have to believe and be alive to the opportunities that can come to us through the work of treading water, or standing still, or just hanging out. I'm not proposing hanging out as an antidote to the manifold problems of climate change, but I am saying that hanging out, which involves pausing and taking stock of one's position within a vast web of social ties, might form the foundation of activities that help to unravel the knot of economic, environmental, and social challenges that is climate change. Now is the time to hang out. So was yesterday, but tomorrow will also do, in a pinch. Thank you very much. I'm going to pause there.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sheila. As we go through the rest of the session today, or people in the audience, please jump in and either put your questions in the chat or the Q&A feature, and we'll be monitoring that as we go. And Sheila, I think a good place to start, and I know this was a question that we got as well, is kind of where did you really start to create this book? Like, what was the inspiration, and were there any personal kind of anecdotes that came from that?
There are, and in the book, the first chapter is one that's called Hanging Out at Parties. And I think parties were one of the first things that got me thinking about this subject, because I realized that parties are sometimes a fraught or controversial subject when you bring them up to people. We think of parties as positive things, as celebrations, as things that we do in order to experience joy and happiness with others. But I think often they are also things that cause us a lot of distress or anxiety or make us feel rather awkward. So I was sort of interested in exploring the two sides of those feelings with regards to parties, and I started writing about them first. And that became kind of an essay that became the rest of the book, in a sense. And then, of course, COVID happened. This was before the COVID pandemic, but then COVID happened and I wasn't going to any parties. And then I had a lot of time to think about all those parties I had been to in the past. And I tell in the story in the book about ending up at a party where I realized that I wasn't exactly welcome at the party, and neither did I really want to be there. This was a party that was a party being held for one of my colleagues previously, before I lived in Vermont, when I was working at the University of North Dakota. And this colleague of mine was leaving for another job, and we had sort of a going away party for her. And I'd never been that close to her or anything, but she invited me. And then at the party, like, she kind of just sort of realized, I think, that she didn't really like me very much, and I kind of realized I didn't really like her. And there was just this moment of standing there being like, what are we doing here? Like, and then she actually kind of called me out on it. She was like, why are you even here? And I was like, because you invited me. And so I think that sort of awkward situation was part of what I was thinking about and exploring when I was trying to get into the difficulties that sometimes are associated with hanging out in other people's presences.
Yeah, I think we've all been there in kind of one of those awkward situations. Um, and kind of as I've reflected on going through the book, this is putting my sociology hat on, is I found a lot of similarities kind of going back to Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone and kind of how
Yeah.
hanging out and these kind of informal group meeting spaces really create a sense of community in ways that social media can never recreate. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit on kind of that level and like, was that an inspiration? How do you think this kind of takes on a new light to that type of concept?
It certainly was. And, Putnam's work is going through a little bit of a renaissance right now, too. It's been re released in a more recent updated edition, which is great to see. Putnam's work was very focused on the idea of democracy in particular, that this. This thing that we do when we get together for, a city council meeting or a PTA meeting or whatever, we are participating in very small instances of that democracy. And if we, decline to participate, then it's not like the democracy is just going to run itself, right? It's not a self-running machine. So yeah, I was very interested in that too. And in the book, I do kind of explore some of the political ramifications of what comes from, basically the lack of hanging out or the lack of engaging in the social sphere, with particular relevance, of course, to the moment that we're in now, which is seeing, the growth of digital and virtual forms of social interaction over in person or what we might think of as more democratic forms of hanging out.
Great.
Jacob, do you mind if I ask a question or
Of course.
maybe take, hi, I'm Ryan from Vermont Humanities. This really struck something for me. I had the good fortune of going to Mexico City in December to a particular neighborhood, and and it wasn't hot. It was, but it was warm enough to sit outside,
Mm-hmm.
even in December. And what was fascinating was, and I'd seen this in Mexico before, is on the weekends people hang out like
Mm-hmm.
outside. That's what you do, and sort of in the center square. Um, and I did spend time observing people, and a lot of folks were sort of strolling through with their families, but there were a lot of people that were just there for hours, like sitting on a park bench or talking with friends. And so I'm a little curious about sort of that nexus of culture and climate or
Yes.
weather. And I don't mean so much climate change, but we live in a place where 6 months of the year we're hunkered down inside.
Right.
And I live in a small community. We're actually working to renovate a building because we say in the summer it's this wildly social little village, but in the winter we just don't see each other because we're all bundled up and it's dark. Um,
Right.
so that was the biggest thing most striking thing for me in visiting Mexico was like how central that is to the culture, just to be, I said to a friend, this is like the Tunbridge Fair every night. It's like that volume of people, and people were just driving in cars to
Mm-hmm.
get to this square to hang out. And so what is it? We live in a cold northern place that has a lot of Northern European influence. I'm just curious about that weather, culture, how that
Weather,
impacts how
yeah,
people hang out.
weather is huge. I absolutely agree. And I think, cultures in more southern parts of the world, geographically speaking, they have an advantage when it comes to hanging out, right? Because they can build those third places that I talk about in the book, they can build them more easily out of doors. And those of us who are up here in the north, we have to figure out other ways. I've lived in 6 states in the United States, and they've all touched the Canadian border. So I'm pretty much a born and bred Northerner, and so I know this feeling. And I think about, for instance, when I lived in North Dakota, a place like Vermont, that 6 months out of the year you're kind of locked down by weather. About the important role that malls often played in those communities, for being places where people could gather indoors. And unfortunately, while I was living in that town in North Dakota, basically all of our malls went under, and they were disappearing, which was too bad because they weren't just for shopping. They were where the mall walkers went in the morning. One of them had a climbing gym right in the center of the mall, and there were people climbing. There were restaurants inside, and then there were stores as well. And so, it's difficult but it's something that we have to think about, I think, very strategically in our northern communities, is like how we can make that same kind of feeling of hanging out on the square happen without the physical outdoor space of the square. And in Vermont, I think one of the ways that we see this happen is through places like libraries. We have a wonderful library network system spread across our local communities. And I think that's one very important way that we see people trying to sort of claim that common space together.
Kind of going back to the effects of the pandemic, we have a question here from Dorothy about looking at how remote school during the COVID years affected children, and do you think that affected kind of their ability to hang out and whatnot, or if it's more just a model of kind of how schooling is changing now?
I think it's both, and I think we're just now starting to see research emerge that's showing us some of the effects of what remote learning was like on children who were, forced to undergo it, of course. But I can tell you also, from an anecdotal perspective, it's been interesting to see students return to the classroom post-pandemic. And, I teach at Champlain College. I moved to Vermont in 2020. I moved across the country to basically teach online for a year and a half, but I didn't know that's how it would be. I thought I would be in person in the classroom, and then, of course, I was not. But in 2021, 2022, when we started to get back together in person, I had imagined this excitement. I had imagined this huge gush of like, oh, it's so great to be back together again. And instead, what I found was a lot of awkwardness. It was like people had felt like they had forgotten some of the habits about how to be in social space with other people. There was some discomfort. And it took a while for that to start to unravel and for people to get more comfortable being together again. But I have seen it happening. So I think it's something that we're going to continue to witness coming out of, the depths of the COVID pandemic and remote education. And I really hope it's something that we're going to work on strategically embracing to build up those social skills and those social habits so that, kids are not left behind.
A great point. And I'll throw in the chat for everyone here in case you missed it, but back in October, we had another professor from Middlebury speak about kind of coming of age in this digital COVID sphere. So if that's a topic you want to explore more, that event recording is there in the link. Another question that came in from Joshua, he wants to credit you, and you put a lot of yourself into the book. How did you decide on that approach rather than taking the more distant third person academic kind of approach for this discussion?
Using the pronoun I has been a long journey for me as a writer. It's like not something that I was trained to do as an academic. I think as academics, we are taught to get very comfortable with the third person and passive voice, and to act like the observations that we're making or drawing from our studies or our research are just like descended from on high or exist there in the ether. And, I've always found that to be in some ways sort of disingenuous because my reading of a text or my interpretation of a study or research or data is not necessarily going to be the same as someone else's. And I think that sometimes there's a little bit of ego that goes into speaking in the third person and thinking like, well, of course, we all believe X or something like that. So over the years, I've kind of become more comfortable with the pronoun I, and I've also become more comfortable with, embracing a sense of my own experience. And I think this actually relates to my teaching, to the way that I interact with people in the classroom too, because that's a lot of what we do in a discussion-based classroom. We swap stories and we share experiences and we say, well, it was different for me. I didn't learn that growing up. Instead, I thought about this or something like that. And that is really valuable learning experience. It's part of the magic that happens when we're in a classroom together, that we can do that. So I've kind of tried to enact that a little bit more over the years in my books. And I think hanging out is so far the most personal of all of them.
Yeah, and you kind of just touched on this, but I'm curious too, is like, how do you put what you put in this book, hanging out, into practice and kind of in the classroom? And do you have any tips for people that maybe are having that that barrier of entry for hanging out, that don't know how to kind of settle themselves and be in the moment?
Well, at the end of last June, Beginning of last June, I met with a class of Burlington High School students, and their teacher brought them up to campus, and we hung out on the Champlain campus, and we were kind of looking at the ways that people hang out in college, looking at the spaces and stuff like that, the way it's designed. But he also wanted me to give them homework for hanging out, right? To like think about, okay, here's an assignment. You're going to go try it, see how it makes you feel. So I gave this class of high school students like a couple of assignments, and one of them was to start a conversation with a stranger, which they all thought was so totally crazy and something they did not want to try doing. It freaked them out a lot. And another one that I suggested to them was, make a date to hang out with a friend. No phones allowed, but don't make a plan. So no agenda of like what you're going to do. Like, well, we're going to go here, or we're going to see this, but sort of like let it develop in the moment. See if you can get together, take that time and see what happens. And I think that's really important because there's a kind of sharing and like democratic interaction that happens in those moments when you realize like, okay, no one's in control here. We're going to make whatever's happening here together. And we have to sort of invent it or improvise. And that can be scary for people. So anyway, they reported back to me on their homework, and it seemed like it was really uncomfortable for most of them, but I hope that they learned something from the process.
No, that sounds incredible. I remember one of my assignments in Intro to Sociology was to write a letter, and like how different that is in these days to like write a physical letter to someone, and kind of the care and that can go into
Right.
that. So
Right.
hanging out without an agenda sounds similar to that. And also another question I have is kind of related to your chapter, really focusing on looking at strangers, and traveling alone for me was such like an eye-opening experience. And so I was wondering if you could tease a little bit to people about that chapter, and kind of talking about what those experiences of traveling alone helped to influence you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I have a chapter that I call Hanging Out with Strangers. And in it, I talk about basically that the experiences of traveling alone and finding yourself sort of forced to hang out with strangers because that's your only option. It's either that or you're by yourself, right? And I've had some of these experiences over my life, and there's something that I've had to increasingly get comfortable with. They're not something that I necessarily would have gone for at a younger, more impressionable age, I think. And I tell a story about a sort of like ill-fated trip that I went on several years ago to Scotland, where I had spent some time studying when I was in undergrad. And then I went back to see some friends of mine over there, and they were actually traveling at the time when I was coming there, but we were going to meet up, and they like gave me keys to their apartment, and I was going to hang out in their apartment until they got back. But that gave me like 5 days where I was just in the city and I didn't know anyone, and I was starting to go stir crazy. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to go out and I'm going to meet some people tonight, and I'm going to find some friends. And I did. I like set that project for myself, and I somehow did. And I never saw those people again for the rest of my life. But I had one very nice evening with these incredibly friendly strangers who I'll never see again. And I guess the reason that I tell this story in the book is also to sort of combat this idea of stranger danger that many of us are raised with. I think many of, especially women are raised with. And there are some good reasons, of course, for having some caution in place when it comes to interacting with strangers. But the story that I tell is like a story that could have ended so badly. If it were a Hollywood movie or something like that, it could have all gone downhill, but it didn't. Nothing happened. We had a nice time, and I never saw them again. That was it.
No, I'll give a plug to traveling in hostels when you have the stamina to do
Exactly.
so. You
The
get some
hostel
of those
experience,
interactions.
right?
Exactly. You never know who you'll become friends with there.
Jacob, do you mind if I
Yeah,
sort
of
of build
course.
on that or have an observation? And one thing I've thought about when I was 19 in college, I went and did a term abroad. I was in Costa Rica, and at the time, it was pre-internet. To call home was extremely expensive,
Mhm.
and so I like lived in a village, and I got to know people my age. It was an incredibly rich experience, and I just reflect a little bit on what you said. So my daughter is now a little bit older than I was when I went, and she's able to bring her entire network with her on her phone.
Right.
So she has her high school if she chooses to. And I actually did not have any mechanism in which to do that except for writing letters or phone
Yeah.
calls, and it just wasn't possible. So in my generation, it was, you sort of left one cohort of friends behind. I was just flagged on this when you said, I'll never see these people again. In my generation, I kind of had that, like, okay, now the high school people, I'm essentially never going to see them again. The college people, most of them I'm never going to see again. But I think for my daughter's generation, it's much more possible. You sort of have lifelong friends, quote unquote, who you're interacting with in the digital space, and
Hmm.
maybe sometimes rarely in the physical space. And I'm
Yeah.
just curious if that changes people's willingness to hang out with strangers,
Oh,
because
yeah.
like, well, I have my friends right here with me, so why would I extend myself like that?
Exactly. I see that on small levels and big levels all the time. In the digital age, we carry our connections with us wherever we go. It's an easy thing for us to do. At the same time, I think sometimes it has the effect of feeling like it places bigger stakes on our interactions with people because there is this sense that's like, well, they're going to be hanging out in the ether there on my Facebook page or whatever for the rest of my life, right? And I think sometimes that can actually lead to anxiety about how some of those interactions unfold. But you're right. If a moment comes up where, we don't have something to do or we don't have anyone to talk to or we don't know anyone in the room, for most of us these days, our first recourse is our phone, right? That is the way to kill time. We will find a friend. We will find someone who agrees with us. We will find someone who knows us. And it won't be as hard as having to like break all that ice with a stranger. And it's right there in front of us and it's so easy to do. And I think that makes us less likely to have some of the interactions that I'm trying to argue for in the book. The interactions where you do strike up a conversation with a stranger, or for that matter, your next door neighbor or the person sitting next to you in a meeting or a classroom. I'm always trying to get my students to talk to each other in the classroom, right? So yeah, it works on a small level too. It's not even just about traveling alone, but also just like the people who are right there in the room with you sometimes.
Yeah, I really resonated with what you had written or on the slide. We cannot know each other without being inconvenient to each other. And I've been thinking about that. I volunteer in a local community organization. As I mentioned, we're trying to create this third space. It's fine in the summer, but we need a place to be in the winter months. And it's not always easy to be a volunteer. And it's, and I think about in Vermont, some of our cultural ways that we solve problems is we use town meeting as kind of the
Right.
model. And sometimes
Yeah.
people are coming to town. It depends on the town. It depends on the people. Sometimes people are coming to town meeting with, I'm going to hold these people accountable. I'm going to nail
Right.
them to the wall about how our money is being spent. And I'm just saying, on the side of a person who's volunteering, that doesn't feel very good. But now
Yeah.
some of what you're saying, I'm reflecting on, well, if we're actually hanging out so rarely, the only times that we're together is in a town meeting type of setting, then it's really easy to feel very kind of hurt about
Yeah.
your next door neighbor saying, why is it taking so long to get the roof repaired on this? If you understand what I'm saying. And kind of the
Yeah.
other thing, and I know I'm saying a lot, but um, the other thing I reflect on is talking about the roads. I was talking with an older neighbor, and he said, "Oh, we just like didn't really go anywhere
Mm.
by and large for 6 months of the year. But it was a
Right.
totally different economy. It was
Right.
farms. People didn't, and so I think the call, and just across the road was a store where everyone went
Hmm.
in the evening. Um, and so it's like that generation had so much more time that they were just, as you say, hanging out, playing checkers or whatever at the store, where we are, at least in the winter months, largely coming together to solve problems in like a town meeting context.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not sure if I'm really asking a question here or if you're able to pull some threads out of that.
Well, I'm really glad that you brought up the idea of the town meeting, which is so important, I think, to the structural ways that we have of hanging out here in Vermont. And the town meeting is a really fantastic and beautiful tradition. I think it's a really like sacred part of our democratic practice here in Vermont. And then you think about the way that phrase has been appropriated in corporate culture. And if you get a meeting from your job that says they're going to have a town meeting, you're like, oh God, right? Like nobody wants to be, it's usually a bad news associated thing. Like somebody on high is going to be telling everybody what has to happen, right? Nobody likes those. And I often think inspired a little bit by my friend and my colleague, Jonathan Beecher Field, who grew up a lot in Vermont and has talked and written a book about how that meeting, that phrase, town meeting, really changed when it was seized by corporate America. But I really think about like how that term has become sort of the inverse. It's not about a lot of people getting up in a room and speaking together and interacting. It becomes a top-down hierarchical model for spreading information that someone else has already decided on. And it's really not the town meeting model. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because we see two different sides of it these days. And I think you're right about town meetings being associated with confrontation, and that taking away some of, what we might want to have happen in our interactions with our neighbors.
Jonathan is actually one of my neighbors. He lives
Oh,
about
no
3
way.
miles. He lives about 3 miles away.
Vermont. Oh my God.
Vermont, yes.
Wow.
He was not the one who held me accountable, by the way. He's lovely.
Oh, he is. He is. Okay. Amazing. Good to know.
Right. And as we're kind of wrapping up our hour here, I'll do a final kind of call to our attendees here for questions. But Sheila, I was wondering if you had if like you could rewrite the book, is there any stories or avenues you would want to take or explore more? Or if there's like a hanging out part two, what would that be about?
Well, there's so many more instances, forms of hanging out, I guess I would say, that I feel like I could talk about. And one that I feel pretty strongly about, that I'm writing an article about at the moment, I think for another publication, is hanging out at funerals. And I know it's a sort of depressing topic for some, but I think it's an important one. Funerals are a type of festive occasion that we have. And this is also partially my insight as a professional bagpiper that is coloring this here. I spend a lot of time hanging out at funerals because I get paid to play bagpipes at them. So I've been to a lot of different funerals over the years, and I've seen conversations unfold about like who deserves to be there, who wants to be there, whether or not children should be invited to funerals, right? Whether or not they should see that and be part of that process. And I find that all very interesting. Because funerals are for the living, right? They are basically occasions that we have for the living to gather together. That is just in the instance of someone else's death, it gets everyone in the same room together so they can remember that person. But also it's for those people, right? It's for their sustenance. It's for whatever they have to deal with, their grief, etc. So I think they're very important occasions. But I've also, since the COVID pandemic, started to notice a kind of turning away from them. I was reading a recent poll that said 61% of Americans no longer say they want a funeral when they die. So just kind of interesting shift in the times.
Oh, that's a really interesting topic. And our attendee here, Glenn, says jury duty is another kind of
yes.
force hanging out that might be an interesting.
Right. And many of us try to get out of that, right? And I know why, because jury duty often comes as an inconvenience to us. We're going back to that Lauren Berlant idea of inconvenience that I was talking about, right? And yet that inconvenience is very central to our democratic process. And it is a way for us to get to know other people in our community. The idea of an impartial jury has to include people from different sides and sectors of the community in order for it to function. So yeah, that's something very significant that we have to do too.
And kind of related to this, I think this is a good question to kind of wrap us up here. Our attendee writes, I'm really surprised about the amount of social responsibility and accountability to each other that comes from this conversation on hanging out. Could you extend upon the relationship of hanging out and the democratic and social responsibility to others? And that really makes me think of empathy building too, right? And
Yes.
how you need to find difference in order to build empathy. So
yeah. Well, I think of it sometimes as akin to like road rage, right? So, like when you're in your car and someone else is in their car and they're doing something you don't like, it's like really easy when you have no idea who that person is to develop this huge grudge against them, this sense of bitterness. And then if we extend that idea to the way that we sometimes interact with folks on the internet, it's like, yeah, a person I can't see, maybe that's your name, maybe it's not. And I don't know that much about you. It becomes so easy to pick a fight with that person or to write them off or to dismiss them or block them or whatever as a way of being like, well, that doesn't matter. That is outside of my orbit and I choose not to interact with that. When we are in a physical space with another person, our total interaction system changes, right? We can't do the things that we do when we're online. We can't just block them or close the tab. We can't just, cut in front of them and maybe swerve off down the road, right? We have to find different ways to navigate that interaction. And I think that's where democracy comes into play through hanging out. Like if we are spending more time in physical proximity to each other, then we have to eventually get a little bit more comfortable with that experience and with some of the inconvenience that comes with it. Dealing with other people and their opinions or their habits or their behaviors or whatever it happens to be. So yeah, great question.
Do you mind if I add a story, Jacob?
Go for it.
This is a,
I'm pro story.
I'm coming here from, deep rural stuff, but my brother who's lived in cities his adult life was hanging out with me, and we were driving somewhere, and we passed somebody and did the thing on the steering wheel, lift your two fingers, and my brother's like, "Oh, is that a good friend of yours?" It's like, "Oh, I can't stand him." And he was like, "Well, why did you wave at him?" It's like, you have to.
It's
You
the
also
nice thing to do. It's rural acknowledgement, right?
and you also don't know when you'll need each other.
Yes.
So
right.
you have to keep a certain, whether civility is the right word, you have to keep a certain level of connection
Yes.
with
Because
because he's just over there. I'm going to see him every day. I can't I can't be hostile to him and
right.
have
And
the
I think
community
that's part of
function
where
really.
that acknowledgement you're talking about, that rural acknowledgement comes from. That little wave from the steering wheel when you see someone. I'm often fascinated by the waves that when you're on a paved road, that would never happen. But the second you get on an unpaved road, regardless of whether or not you're a local, regardless of whether or not you live there, all of a sudden you're getting the wave from everybody you see. It's like as soon as traffic thins down, then suddenly we can recognize other humans. Like we have that ability to.
Yeah, that was probably my last question was, for you in Vermont, do you see hanging out happens differently?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm going to pick on Chittenden County. Happens
Yeah.
differently in Chittenden County versus other parts of the state. And I know there's other rural parts of the state too, but
It certainly does. When I moved here, I knew that that would sort of be the case. It's a cold place, it's a rural place. I've lived in places like that before, and I know that it takes a while to find your way into communities when those are the circumstances that you're dealing with. You don't have that town square that you can sit around and meet people that way. So it takes a while. And, one thing I've observed about Vermont in general is that hanging out happens in private spaces a lot. It happens inside, and that means you have to get to know people in order to get invited to the private spaces, which is the whole issue with it, and that's why third spaces are a really good idea. But it takes a while. You have to get to know your neighbors and have conversations with them before they're going to invite you in their house, and so that can be part of the challenge. The other side of that is what we see increasingly in Chittenden County, which I think has its own kind of reputation now for like how hanging out is happening there too. But I will say, in the Burlington area, we have some pretty earnest attempts at building third spaces, and we see them. Like the Church Street Marketplace is exactly that, right? That was what it was built for. It's still got the problem of being very freezing cold a lot of the year. But that is a place where we are supposed to be able to kind of like pass each other on the street and mix openly.
Well, thank you, Sheila. I just want to give another shout out. If you haven't checked out her book yet, please do. I know a lot of the libraries have it in circulation
It looks like
already.
this.
It does. It has a beautiful, distinctive cover, which I love.
It's kind of
Um,
disco, and I like that too.
oh yeah, I didn't even think about that. A good disco tile floor. Hanging out on the dance floor could be the next one. So I just wanted to thank you again for your time this evening. It was really great getting to know you and hearing more insights about the book. And of course, thank you to Joanne and all of our friends at the Goodrich Memorial Library. If you are interested in next week's event, Monumental Mobility, the memory work of Massasoit, that will be next week at 7 o'clock as well. So we hope to see you there. And without further ado, have a great night, everyone. Thanks again for joining.
Thank you, everyone.